The legalization of sports wagering has got the entire industry buzzing. Some see it as a new revenue stream. Others are concerned about, well, the integrity of the game. Today, we're going to ask three questions. Who stands to make money from the legalization of sports gambling in the U.S.? Are games now at a greater risk of being fixed? And lastly, tanking when teams don't try to win. Is that fraud? Or is it a justifiable business strategy? Today on the Sports Business Show, a question of integrity. On May 14th, 2018, the rules all changed.
Congress had ordered states to not allow gambling in their states. And the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that, Congress. You can't tell state legislatures what they can and cannot do. So right now, at this moment, there's no law preventing gambling.
That legislative void won't last for long. State-specific rules are popping up like gophers on a golf course.
There are 5 states that recently passed gambling laws. So you can expect those 5, one of which is New Jersey, to jump ahead because they're ahead of everybody else. But apparently there's 20 more states that are thinking seriously about doing it. So that's, half the states.
It's no secret state governments are eager to regulate gambling so they can tax it.
I think there's a misconception at how profitable sports gaming is. The profit margin last year on sports betting in Nevada was a little over 5%. 5% profit margin. So at that profit margin, something like a tax rate can have an enormous effect on whether or not you are actually successful in turning a profit or a loss.
State-by-state regulations will also cause mass confusion for online bettors. Currently, Boyd Gaming in Nevada offers mobile sports betting through an app, but it's geo-locked. That means it stops working as soon as you leave the state. If people have to switch to a different app every time they cross a state border, they will very quickly turn back to the black market.
In an ideal world, we'd love to see one size fits all and something in the federal government versus it's just not reality. That's not the reality of the business. Most likely, it will go state by state.
Regardless of who takes the lead, the goal is to move illegal sports betting into a regulated framework.
We know that approximately 150 to 190 billion are bet outside the US. So all these potential revenues go offshore.
It's important that the gaming industry, the law enforcement community, that the leagues are all sort of working in tandem to develop the best business model or best model in place then that will ensure that we do have a sustainable sports betting market versus what we've seen some of the proposals right now, which are high tax rates, which don't promote then moving customers from the illegal, unregulated market into the legal, regulated market.
Once the tax man gets his cut off the top, the real fight begins.
The leagues are going to ask for 1% of the take. They call this the integrity fee, which I love that phrase. I doubt that they'll get it. States are not going to want to give up 1% of the take to give it to the teams.
The players also want a piece. Their argument is, without us, you wouldn't have anything to bet on.
They are utilizing and betting on teams based upon what players are on those teams. Not what city they're in, not what stadium they're in, not who owns them, but they're basing that upon the individual performance of a player and how well he's going to do.
Players have made this case that putting their name on a betting slip is using their likeness to endorse a product.
But you're not really using the player's persona to promote anything. They are simply the subject of what you're betting on.
This is not something where they can just say it's nature. We're not betting on events that are, acts of God.
Getting a direct cut from the betting is just one of the many ways for teams to bring in new revenue.
You can imagine some hospitality areas being rezoned into gaming zones or sports books.
We're in over 40 stadiums in the UK. You can walk in, and no different than walking in and getting yourself a hot dog and a beer. You can walk up to one of our betting kiosks and be able to place a wager on that particular game in the stadium.
You could also imagine the network side, networks getting highly involved, and maybe the original programming shifts to CNBC-style offerings with multiple tickers along the bottoms and a lot more analysts like Matthew Berry placing buys on certain players and sells on other players.
Well, it all sounds so rosy, lots of new money coming in, and the biggest problem is deciding how to split it up. But there is a darker side to gambling, the threat of fixing.
The biggest threat to professional sports is gambling. Because if the games became fixed, that would reduce professional sports to wrestling.
Others claim the betting industry is defending the game's integrity.
We have algorithms that tell us pre-match already if there's something going on, but then also if the game is going on, like, okay, what is the different betting behavior? What is the volume? So we have really the global picture on what's going on.
From a business perspective, it really makes sense, right? I mean, the integrity of our product is paramount to its success. The reason we've been able to become an established industry and accepted industry is because people trust the games are fair.
The majority of the money being bet is placed on high-profile events like the Super Bowl, but most of the shady deals are done at the other end of the spectrum.
Usually match fixer would approach players that are not paid so well, young players that don't know what they get into.
Young and underpaid also describes the 460,000 college athletes across America.
I think that obviously when you have athletes who are not being compensated, they're much more susceptible then to being on the take, because $2,000, $5,000, whatever the incremental money is for them to be offered to throw an event is far more enticing than for those players that make $20 million.
That has led to calls for gambling on college sports to remain illegal.
We do not believe that amateur sports should have any sort of carve-out. They should be part of the legal regulated system that by having more transparency, by having more data, being able to tell then when something is happening is far better than what's taking place right now, which again, you know, we have no idea because we have a huge illegal market and people are betting and we don't know what's going on.
Tracking betting behavior is a great way to discover if something untoward is going on, but that doesn't necessarily solve the problem of who is going to prosecute it. Strictly speaking, throwing a game isn't a crime. Might be a breach of contract, but that's a civil matter between a player and his employer. The police actually have no authority to investigate whether or not a quarterback threw an interception on purpose. Conversely, the leagues can punish their players, but they have no authority to prosecute people who don't work for them, even if they're seeking to influence the outcome of games. Coming up next, what do you do with teams that are deliberately losing games in order to improve their draft position?
So, you know, I actually don't even, this is the strangest part, I don't think the fans even mind if the team is tanking.
The theory is, in order to win, first you have to lose. It might actually be the prevailing sentiment in pro sports these days. Fans of mediocre clubs continually and loudly call for their general managers to blow the team up and start over. It's an approach that was clearly demonstrated in October 2016.
Here's the 0-1. This is going to be a tough play. Bryant, the Cubs win the World Series! Bryant makes the play! It's over! And the Cubs have finally won it all! 8-7 and 10.
The way the Cubs built that championship roster has caught the attention of other clubs.
Their approach has been insanely successful.
Players and their agents are not as enthusiastic.
This has created a cancer, what I call the non-competitive cancer. There are 12 that really, their expectations of being in the playoffs are slim to none.
The error Scott makes there is that saying they're not trying to win is, of course, the opposite of the truth, which shouldn't surprise you. I think they are all trying to win, and given where they are, what they're doing is probably the quickest way for them to get there.
It's not just the lack of activity in free agency. Boros sees the impact on the trade market too.
There was a creation of a all-star level talent dump that we've seen occur in Miami, where you saw 4 all-star players essentially placed in the marketplace all at one time. It's kind of funny that you buy something and then you say you can't afford to operate it, all in a setting of record revenues, I might add.
The result was a lot of teams fielding rosters of young, inexpensive players, while more qualified veterans remained unemployed.
That process obviously leads to a grand impact on the collective bargaining agreement, because the luxury tax threshold was designed and revenue sharing was designed on the basis of competitiveness.
The CBA introduced spending limits and shared revenue. It was meant to help small market teams compete.
That premise has now morphed into something that is now a bar to competitiveness, where clubs are using the excuse that it's in the best interest of our club to not do well for certain periods of years in the major league. And that was not in any way the intentions of the drafters of the CBA.
The decision to tank, or at least not try and win, depends partly on the market you play in.
When we came here to Los Angeles, we understood that we had a built-in group of 45,000 people that were going to be here every night. That's what came to us in the bargain. Our side of that bargain was that we would compete and contend right away, and yet what was important to us was that we were going to build our team long-term. Now, because of the support in the marketplace, though, we were able to do both things simultaneously. I admit most markets don't have that opportunity, but we did.
I think the important part is to be transparent around your vision and what you're trying to do, and communicate that to your fan base.
The Philadelphia 76ers gutted their roster in 2013. They spent the next 4 years trying to lose as many games as they could. In those 4 drafts, they picked third, first, and first. They stockpiled a roster of young, high-ceiling talent and are now a competitive club. Throughout it all, their management asked the fans to trust in what they were doing.
Everybody jokes about trust the process, but trust the process was not just a marketing slogan. It was a communication from ownership down to the fans. It said, look, we need to rebuild this thing. We need to think about it differently. We're probably going to have a few down years before we get back to where we want to be, because that's how you have to build in this business.
So, I actually don't even, this is the strangest part, I don't think the fans even mind if the team is tanking, because you're thinking to yourself, oh, they're going to try to get better. They want to be the worst so they can get better.
Keeping the faith of the fans is one thing. You also need to hold on to your corporate sponsors.
Everyone looks like a genius when you're winning. Everything is great. They say winning cures all, and that's not, untrue in some ways. But if all you're banking on is the fact that the team will win and win and win, you're not going to be able to go very far with your partner. So for me, it's really about, if we understand what the objectives are and how that lines up with what we're doing, we can hopefully deliver ROI for those partners beyond what we can and can't control in the field.
There is a chance that the system could correct itself.
When the Cubs did that, or when the Astros did that, there were not many other teams doing that. Now there are a flood of teams. So now there are 7 or 8 people trying to get the high draft picks as opposed to 1 or 2, and that's going to dramatically affect the benefit of losing as well.
The other factor that could keep tanking from overwhelming a league is human nature.
Most of the people that own these things are very competitive people. They want to win. You're not buying a team to say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to buy this team and I'm going to lose and I'll make more money by losing. No. When your team is struggling to make the playoffs, you're going to do what it takes.
Individually, each team might justify tanking in the interest of future success, but when it's done on a league-wide scale, well, everybody loses.
I think the owners are going to find that this is going to have dramatic impact on their franchise and their brand. We have severely damaged the best baseball brand in the world by saying we're not going to compete. When fans find out that you're non-competitive for a major portion of a decade, the detriment is going to clearly outweigh the benefit.
After the break, I'll be joined by Don Fehr, the head of the NHL Players Association, and we'll find out what he's doing to make sure clubs are doing their best to win. So the topic of the day is integrity. No better person to address that issue with than Don Fehr, the executive director of the NHL Players Association. Don, let's start with gambling, legalized sports gambling. The way is now open for individual U.S. states to set up their own sports gambling laws. The PA, along with the other Players Association, sent out a group release saying that the players needed a seat at the table in order to ensure players' rights, the integrity of the game being protected. A cynical person might think that what you're really looking for is cut of the action.
People can be as cynical as they would like, but the fact is that if there ends up with widespread legalized gambling on professional sports in the United States, or professional and amateur, or the U.S. and Canada, a lot of things could potentially change. There's going to be a lot of people making a lot of money on the players' names, likenesses, performances, work, risk, and all the rest of it. In addition to that, there's the possibility that there will be questions raised as odds change. And when you represent players, your job is to make sure that all of their working conditions, terms and conditions of employment, are appropriate, that they address the specific issues that are there. And we just don't believe that these things can go on with all of the decisions being made by someone other than the players or their designated representatives and end up in a fair system. So we want to be there as those decisions are made.
Don, let's change gears a little bit here. The other integrity issue we've been looking at is tanking. Scott Boras told us that in his view, 12 teams in Major League Baseball are not actively trying to win. Well, what about the NHL? Do you see teams not signing free agents, not putting their best group on the ice in an attempt to bottom out?
Well, let me address this first generally and then specifically. As a general matter, anytime you're talking about tanking, something is a little awry, something is a little bit off, because you're suggesting that a team is not putting its best players on the field in a maximum attempt to win that game. And that affects how its own fans view it, it affects how fans of the game view it, and it obviously affects competitive races as between teams. In the NHL, it has not been an issue of really significant concern as of yet. Hopefully it will not be. In the NHL, there's a system in place, I think, as everybody knows, that determines odds of getting the first draft choice. So that tends to limit the ability to do that. Last thing, though, and I think this is really important, where you have a situation in which access to players is going to be determined by a series of mechanisms. My view has always been, and this is a personal view, this is not something that's been discussed with my membership, but my view has always been that there needs to be a sufficiently large amount of revenue sharing from the higher income teams to the lower income teams, such that they are not strapped into a situation in which they would have to do extraordinary things, like not try to win games in order to put themselves in a better position to get better players going forward. We have extensive revenue sharing now in the NHL. It came in the last CBA. I am pretty sure it will be a subject of discussions the next time we get into it. But where the owners are going to come in and choose other owners in locations in which they don't have the opportunity to generate the same level of income as some of the existing owners, at that point, revenue sharing becomes, I think, almost an obligation.
Thanks, Don.
Glad to be with you.
Don Fehr, Executive Director of the National Hockey League Players Association. After the break, the deal of the century features a man whose integrity was questioned by his teammates in the 1970s, but who's regarded by modern-day players as a hero. In 1969, the St. Louis Cardinals baseball team traded Curt Flood, Tim McCarver, Byron Brown, and Joe Horner to the Philadelphia Phillies for Dick Allen, Cookie Rojas, and Jerry Johnson. It's a big baseball trade. 5 of the 7 players were All-Stars. But the trade was bigger than baseball. It impacted all of professional sports because of what Curt Flood did after he was traded. He refused to report and said that after 12 years of professional baseball, he should be able to determine where he played. He wanted to be a free agent. Curt sued the league for $1 million, but lost the case. He lost the battle, but not the war. 7 years later, in 1976, Major League Baseball and the Players Association signed a new collective bargaining agreement, giving players the right to become free agents. That clause has made millionaires out of thousands of players, and it's all thanks to Curt Flood. So here's what we know. Gambling is big business. Moving it from the black market to a regulated one might generate tax revenue. But when multiple franchises are openly and publicly telling their fans they aren't trying to win, it's going to be hard to know who's throwing a game for draft position and who might be on the take.
We have an assumption when we're watching a hockey game or a football game or a baseball game that the players are playing on an even playing field, that both coaches are trying to win, that the players are trying to win, and that they'll do everything in their efforts to win. So you believe you're watching a real, legitimate athletic contest. If you ever had compromised players who were shading performance, we would lose professional sports.